Thank you very much. Just apologies for the background. I had to make it home in time for dinner with the kids, and I'm in the midst of moving. So as you can see, there's like this sheet behind me to indicate something behind me which used to be there. Anyway, thank you very much for the kind introduction again, and wonderful to be back. And I understand we're really sort of at the end of a very long and a day. So hopefully I'll be able to present something interesting. So I'm just going to share my slides and then we can get going. 1 second, share screen. All right. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. So so I've been given a tall order, just like always have been. I was told to present an overview of climate policy and law in the ASEAN region. And I thought that the only way to really do it sensibly in 15 minutes was to actually present a brief overview of what's happening in ASEAN, and to zoom in on one country, which I'm familiar enough with, which is Singapore, as an example. And it is by no means a representative example, but there is no representative example of ASEAN. It is a region of extremely different countries, as I will briefly touch upon in my next slide. So when we look at this map of Asia, as you can see right over there, Bhutan, and the colored parts of the map are referring to the countries that make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also known as ASEAN. If you look at the region, as you can see, it's made up of about 10 countries, and Timor-Leste has formally been given an invitation to join ASEAN, and the process is ongoing, and it only was, Timor-Leste was formally invited last year. Now, if you look at the countries, made up of extremely diverse countries in terms of its socioeconomic conditions, as well as its geographical conditions. If you look here at Indonesia, it is the world's largest archipelago nation. It is an archipelago made up of about 17,000 islands. And I believe that latest studies indicate that Indonesia is about to lose about 900 islands every year due to sea level rise. Indonesia is also the second largest exporter of coal in the world. You see here, tiny Singapore. It's so tiny they needed to have this little map here an insert to highlight where Singapore actually is. It's so tiny. And we have other countries here like Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, all of which are, well, Myanmar would be the least developed country, and the rest of the countries are at various stages of economic development. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, Lucas.
That's why they just give me this.
That's lovely. Okay, Lucas, you cannot join me now. Okay, you can join me now. Just sit here. Okay, so you have to just sit here, okay? All right, so if you look at ASEAN, made up of 10 countries, this is a table that shows ASEAN's current greenhouse gas emissions by country. And if you look at the, I'm not going to go into the statistics, but you can see that by far, Indonesia is the largest, has the largest carbon footprint, largely because of its heavy reliance on coal as a source of energy, as well as the fact that it exports a lot of coal. So that's something to note. It, however, also has a lot of green coverage and some of the most beautiful rainforests in the world, which unfortunately is being lost at a rapid rate. If you look at the capacity to make a transition to a low carbon future, and looking at the capacity for renewable energy in the ASEAN region, you can see that if you look at the table on the left basically looks at the aggregated renewable energy capacity of the ASEAN member states, all of which have been hovering at very low levels until about 2018. But still, The only country that has made staggering improvement in installing and improving renewable energy capacity is Vietnam. And here, if you look at the blue line, that's basically referring to Thailand, which has had a good amount of renewable energy capacity installed. But if you look at the graph on the right, now then you see how ASEAN, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, compare to the ASEAN plus 3 community. And ASEAN plus 3 is the political slogan or the political reference to refer to the ASEAN member states and the 3 countries of China, Korea, and Japan. And you can see that China by far has far more renewable energy capacity installed. And this is sort of a bit of a contextualization of what's the region looking like. Now, when we talk about ASEAN, ASEAN is by far nothing compared to the European Union in terms of a institutional organization, where as a regime or as a union. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, was formed during the Cold War to promote stability in a very, very volatile region. Singapore was one of the founding members of ASEAN. And if we look back at the archival materials, Singapore played a formative role in ASEAN because Singapore was terrified about what was happening in the region, being sandwiched between 2 extremely large countries, large and powerful countries, and also the fact that this political turbulence required some kind of stability. What does this mean? ASEAN remains foremost an organization to maintain and promote political stability in a region of countries that have very different priorities in certain ways and also different political systems. Decision-making within ASEAN is by consensus. Therefore, many things take a long time. The ASEAN Charter, as well as the way of work, is governed by the principle of non-interference in the affairs of domestic member states. This also makes it quite challenging for harmonization of laws and institutions across the region. Within ASEAN, I am by no means an expert on ASEAN, and when I look at the work that they do, it's always staggering how how many working groups and pillars they have. So basically, the work of ASEAN is often organized according to pillars and working groups, and there are thousands and thousands of working groups across all areas, from fisheries to security cooperation, from anti-terrorism to food security. The fact that that work is organized according to working groups, it's a long-standing practice, but from an outsider's point of view, one often wonders how things get done because of the silos. So for example, if you take an issue like air pollution, and there has been transboundary air pollution that has been caused by forest fires in Indonesia. It's well documented. Everyone refers it to as the haze in Southeast Asia. If you take it to a group on climate change, the working group on climate change, and say the haze is a big problem from climate change perspective, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from each episode of forest fires is incredible. We need to do something about it. The working group on climate change will say, that's correct, but haze is transboundary air pollution. You therefore take it to the air pollution working group. You are in the wrong working group. This organization of work therefore makes it quite challenging to have that sort of the kind of work that tackling environmental challenges require, which is really working across disciplines and overcoming these sorts of divisions. But that is the way it's done within ASEAN. Now, when we talk about ASEAN, therefore, what are most of the things that we can talk about? A lot of policies, a lot of efforts at trying to push for common denominators and policies at the regional level. I name here some of the efforts that are being pursued and have been pursued in ASEAN. I'm no means going to read through all of them. Just to highlight a few things. One is that there is this climate change is being tackled across various working groups through forestry, through energy, through culture, through transport. So this is some of the initiatives which I'm happy to talk more about later, but it's a little bit of it's a lot of high level policies. There's also a strong emphasis on strengthening ASEAN member states' ability to respond to disasters. ASEAN does have several mechanisms, initiatives, and policies and programs all focused on disaster management. And there we see a lot of work on the ground in terms of adaptation, climate change adaptation, because the region suffers significant natural disasters, floods, forest fires, etc., especially in recent years, and many of it climate related. So that's ASEAN. So I'll just kind of narrow down to looking at what happens in Singapore, bearing in mind that what happens in Singapore, when we talk about policy making in Singapore, while the ASEAN frameworks and while Singapore plays an active role in the ASEAN community, the ASEAN framework isn't what's driving policy making in Singapore on climate change. Why is this so? Largely because Singapore takes a more global view in terms of what it needs to be doing to respond to climate change. And while it's important to support the region, it's not by any means being guided solely by the ASEAN frameworks. So let's have a look at what happens in Singapore. So first of all, Singapore is a terribly small country. It's also one of the most densely populated countries in the world. We are 6 million people living on top of each other in 720 square kilometers. I know. Another piece of information that I think is useful for contextualizing how Singapore is positioned is that it is one of the richest countries in ASEAN. The GDP per capita in 2022 was hitting US dollars 82,000. And if we compare that to our nearest neighbor, Malaysia, which has about US dollars 13,000, and then one of our, the poorest countries within ASEAN, Laos, has a GDP per capita of 7,950. So you can see that's huge disparity in capabilities. And this is something that also is very much understood in terms of how the Singapore government tries to support other countries in the region in its adaptation and capacity building. There's a lack of natural resources. We depend on everyone around us for food, water, and you name it. It is an active participant in international climate change negotiations. Singapore has always played an active role in the COPs. And in Singapore, what is a popular slogan is that in tackling climate change, Singapore adopts an all-of-government approach. What does this mean? It means that climate governance in Singapore is pretty much executive-driven. It's driven by all of government in the sense of the executive. We do not have framework legislation on climate change in Singapore. And to the best of my knowledge, there is no framework legislation on climate change in any of the ASEAN countries. There is a heavy emphasis on mainstreaming sustainability in Singapore in its economic activities and establishing itself as a carbon trading hub and hub for sustainability services for the region. And I'll talk a little bit more to this in a bit. So when we talk about climate governance in Singapore, this is what we call the all-of-government approach. At the highest level is the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change. This is chaired by Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean, and he is possibly he sits in the Prime Minister's office and has a direct line to the Prime Minister. The Interministerial Committee on Climate Change, which is right there, sets the overall direction. The entire committee is made up of all the ministers responsible for all the portfolios ranging from education, trade and finance, industry, culture, and environment, of course. Now, under the Interministerial Committee sits the IMCCC, which is the Interministerial Committee, the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee is actually made up of the permanent secretaries of each of the ministries. Singapore adopts the British Civil Service model. So the permanent secretaries, I always wondered why they're called secretaries, because they're very, very important people. And people always think of secretaries, but that's just misleading. Anyway, the Executive Committee is a very important committee made up of all the permanent secretaries, heads of the civil service of each ministry. And they are responsible for coordinating action across all of the ministries, and they have various working groups, and here they are. There is a Resilience Working Committee, which is really about adaptation. And then there's Green Economy, which is really looking at sustainability and transition in terms of what the green economy would mean for Singapore in terms of jobs for young Singaporeans and things like that. We have a net zero future. Well, this is our net zero commitment. If you go to Climate Tracker will tell you it's grossly unambitious. So nothing to be shouting about. The Green Plan, here is an infographic. There's all the different pillars of action that are being taken in Singapore. I think they are all fairly standard, things like planting lots of trees to tackle urban heat island effect, promoting electric vehicles. And in terms of adaptation, we are focusing on strengthening our flood infrastructure as well as coastal defenses. Unfortunately, Singapore has no more natural beaches left. So all that is left to be done is to build seawalls, basically to secure the, basically to protect the island from sea level rise. I'll just talk a little bit about one of the key features of Singapore's climate action, but I will not take more than 1 minute.
Okay, thanks.
So basically, carbon tax, very simple. We have a carbon tax. It's the first carbon tax in Southeast Asia. Indonesia has just introduced one. You can see it's quite low. Started out at $5. It's now going up to $25 per ton. And will go up to 45 in a couple of years and set to rise to about 50. Again, not terribly ambitious because according to to estimates, you usually need about a US $100 per ton to actually galvanize some action. The government has announced that Singapore will be allowing high quality international carbon offsets for companies to meet the obligations under Singapore's carbon tax. I can talk a little bit more about this because it has real implications for the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and all these carbon projects that Singapore is sourcing from around the world. Thank you very much.